Queen Ursula, well, first of all, could I thank Kieran and Glenn for giving me the honour of, in effect, representing the Oireachtas here today. I see so many people from the Oireachtas. I think it speaks volumes as to what Kieran mentioned about the cynicism that we have in society about our elected representatives. And I think what happened over the last number of weeks in the Oireachtas is, as he said, a great testimony to those people who inhabit Leinster House. I said publicly at a press council launch of their annual report recently that when I started in politics 23 years ago, in national politics 23 years ago, there was more interest in what was being discussed in the Senate and in the Dáil. Unfortunately, in more recent times, there's less interest in what is said and more interested in the peccadillos of the personalities that inhabit Leinster House. And what you have in Leinster House is no more than a microcosm of Irish society. We're no different. We have faults and failings, no more than Irish society. And that's as it should be, because we are the representatives of the people. But I do think that what happened in the last while was a great credit to our profession. It's a profession I didn't particularly start out in. It's a profession that, in my case, happened more by chance than anything else, but I'm very proud. And I've often said that I need go no further than the 5th floor of Leinster House, which is where my parliamentary party meet on a weekly basis, to get wisdom and to get an understanding of how the Irish people think at any current time. I also want to acknowledge the small number of people who, to a certain extent, found issue with some of the things in the bill. And I want to acknowledge the presence here of my good friend Jim Walsh, who, I can say this to this audience, spoke very genuinely as to how he felt. And I think it would have been wrong if there hadn't been some voice to query and to question what was in this bill, no more than any other bill that we pass through the Oireachtas. I want to thank particularly, and just before I leave you, I do want to say this, that those of us in public life are well used to the brickbats. And you know, Jim did say publicly in the Oireachtas that he was pressurised and he was the target of some sort of fairly nasty attacks on him. And I have to say that, you know, I personally was on both sides, in that I wasn't going, or we weren't going far enough on either side. But you know, we're all public representatives, we broad shoulders, we can take the brickbats. But I want to compliment GLEN for the way in which they lobbied to bring us to where we are today. And I know it's their view that, you know, there's more to be done, and that's definitely their view and their wish, and I wish them well in that respect. But I do want to compliment them on the realistic and reasonable way in which they lobbied all of the political parties, and all of the political parties would have had some issues in relation to this particular piece of legislation. But they did it in such a way that I think everyone fully understood that they were being reasonable. They understood the parameters within which we were required to work. From my party's point of view, and I don't want to be overly political in relation to this, you know, there was some suggestion that there were tensions between ourselves and the Greens. Mary White's here today representing the Green Party. I want to say in government there was absolutely no problem between our parties, and indeed the PDs represented by Mary Harney in this respect. We were completely idem in relation to the requirement and the promise that we made when we put the programme for government together, and indeed when we reviewed it just a year ago, that we would, as soon as possible, bring forward this piece of legislation. And we were very proud to do that. And I know, and I can't speak for the opposition parties, but we jocosely said that I don't think I've ever had as much agreement on any subject that I brought forward as Minister through the Oireachtas. But again, I think that shows the maturity of how our society has changed fairly dramatically. But as I say, we wanted to bring this legislation forward. Yes, of course, there are people who feel that it has gone too far. There are other people who feel that it hasn't gone far enough. The fact of the matter is, and it's more than any other issue that I have to deal with as Minister or anyone who's in Cabinet, we have to deal based on the legal advice that we get from the Attorney General, who ultimately is the arbiter as far as the government are concerned as to how far we can go in relation to any piece of legislation. And he is obviously dictated to by the Constitution. As we are as legislators, we cannot pass legislation that we feel would go counter to the Constitution. And that's why, to a certain extent, this legislation, and I suppose again after the debate, as Kieran has said, a somewhat fraught debate at committee stage, not at second stage where the sort of general principle speeches are made. The committee stage is where you go through the bill line by line, and it was somewhat fraught. But it was fraught in that there were so many amendments, and I make this point, I thought about it afterwards, that I was under pressure as Minister to accept amendments, and I suppose I said to myself afterwards, it's just as well I didn't accept any amendments, because you could see that there were people who were diametrically opposed in relation to some of these issues. But it again amplified how little room for manoeuvre that I as Minister had in relation to the way in which the legislation was tailored, given the fact on the one hand we have an article in the Constitution which guarantees that everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. There is a conditionality on that to allow the government to make distinctions between various groups in our society. And then on the other hand, the other article in the Constitution which mandates the Oireachtas to pass laws to protect the special position of marriage. And the Supreme Court has many times decided on what is regarded as marriage under the Constitution in that respect. And there were the constraints within which I as Minister and the government had to work. It may not have satisfied, as I say, everybody, but I believe it's a good balance. Today is a celebration for all of the people who in GLEN and the other organisations who have been lobbying for this. GLEN have done, as I said, a marvellous job. I want to thank Kieran and all the people associated with GLEN for the way in which they did their business. I want to particularly thank them for the excellent productions that they have brought forward very quickly as a result of the passing of this legislation and hopefully ultimately into law. I want to say that as far as the government are concerned, we will be bringing forward the legislation in the social welfare area and in the taxation area as quickly as possible. We want this bill to commence when those pieces of legislation are in place, so that everything just kicks in at the one time. That work is going on as we speak. It's nearly finalised, I understand, in relation to social welfare, and obviously the Department of Finance and the next finance bill will bring forward the change. But again, say this, that again the guarantee is that the same taxation and social welfare rights as are available to the wider public will be available to the gay lesbian community. I just want to finish by and again it's a quote from myself, which I have to say encapsulates for me, where we've come as a country. I mean, I did attend recently the launch of a report in Outcomers in Dundalk, which wasn't about the gay community themselves. It was about the families of the gay community, the siblings and the mothers and fathers. And I thought it was an extremely evocative occasion, and particularly a lady called Shoot, who I knew most of my life around Dundalk, who got up, I didn't realise it before then, and gave testament to the fact that 20 years previously one of her sons came out, and she instanced the difficulties that she and her husband and family had in that respect. And as I said in the Senate, if I had any doubts, and I didn't have any doubts about introducing this legislation, they were totally dispelled recently when I attended the function and so on. And that is the case, genuinely. I think that it is the epitome of a Christian society and a sort of a pluralist society that we have here in Ireland, that we bring forward legislation like this. I think, as I said, it was a good day for the Oireachtas, and indeed it was a good day, I think, for the Irish society generally. So again, thanks to GLEN, and thanks particularly to my Oireachtas colleagues for the work that they did unstintingly in relation to this bill.